Apply. In the year 1453, the world stood on the edge of change. A city of legends, a wall of unshakable strength, and a kingdom that believed it could never fall. Apply. But history had other plans. Constantinople, the jewel of Byzantium, was about to face its final hour. Cannons thundered, warriors clashed. Apply. And the greatest walls ever built trembled under the weight of destiny. What unfolded was not just a battle, but the moment Europe's history was written forever. Tonight, Apply, we step inside the mysteries, the bravery, the betrayal, and the unstoppable march of empires. Stay with us because the story you're about to hear is filled with twists, secrets, Apply, and shocking truths that textbooks rarely reveal. And before we dive deep into this unforgettable journey, make sure to subscribe, Apply, and drop your thoughts in the comments because your voice helps bring history alive again. For centuries, the walls of Constantinople stood as a symbol of defiance. Apply, a fortress so strong that kings, sultans, and entire empires shattered against it. Imagine a city where 3 layers of towering stone rose one after another. Apply, each wall designed not just to protect but to intimidate. The outer wall vast and stretching across the horizon, guarded by a deep moat filled with water. The middle wall, Apply, higher and thicker, armed with battlements where soldiers stood watch. And then the inner wall, the ultimate barrier, rising almost 40 feet into the sky. Apply, so wide at the top that chariots could ride across it. These were not walls of stone alone. They were the guardians of Christendom, the last shield of the Byzantine Empire. Apply, a capital that had once been called the very heart of Rome's eastern world. The people of Constantinople believed their walls were invincible, and history gave them every reason to. Apply, time and again armies had tried to breach them, only to fail. From Persians to Arabs, from Avars to Bulgars, the city had seen wave after wave of attackers. Apply, yet the stones still stood tall. They withstood earthquakes, sieges, and centuries of warfare. For over 1,000 years, the city endured. Apply, earning a reputation as the unbreakable jewel of Europe. And as long as the Theodosian walls remained, the Byzantines believed Constantinople would never fall. But walls, Apply, no matter how mighty, carry with them a silent curse, the belief that nothing can overcome them. As the Ottomans advanced, Apply, led by Sultan Mehmed II, just 21 years old yet burning with ambition. He saw not a fortress to fear, but a challenge to conquer. The Byzantines trusted their walls. Apply. Mehmed trusted in something new, technology. And it was here at the edges of Constantinople that the old world of stone would clash with the new age of gunpowder. Still, Apply, in those opening days of the siege, the defenders felt confident. Behind the walls, they gathered what little army remained, barely 7,000 soldiers, will Apply, outnumbered almost one by the Ottoman host. But their hearts clung to the walls, to their strength, to the centuries of victories carved into their stones. Apply citizens prayed beneath the domes of Hagia Sophia, lighting candles to saints who had guarded the city for a millennium. The walls weren't just fortifications. Apply, they were faith made solid, hope made visible, destiny written in stone. Every tower, every gate, every battlement held the weight of an empire's belief that they were unshakable. Apply. And yet cracks were already forming. The walls that had once seemed eternal now bore the scars of time. Some sections had not been properly repaired for years. Apply, weakened by neglect and dwindling resources. The empire was no longer what it had been. Constantinople, once a beacon of wealth and power, had shrunk into a shadow of itself. Apply. The vast defenses remained, but the city behind them had withered. As the great Ottoman cannons were dragged into place, the sound of iron wheels groaning over the earth echoed a warning. Apply, the walls, for all their glory, were about to face something they had never encountered before. Gunpowder, fire, Apply, and the relentless ambition of a young sultan determined to etch his name into history. For the defenders standing upon the battlements, Apply, the sight of those monstrous cannons must have sent a chill deeper than the fiercest winter they had watched armies camp below before. Apply, but never had they seen weapons that could hurl stones weighing half a ton, crashing into ancient walls with the force of thunder. At first, they trusted the walls would endure. Apply, that the stones would resist, as they always had. But as the ground shook with each strike, as dust filled the air and cracks spread wider, the unthinkable crept closer. Apply, the impregnable fortress, the walls that had kept the city alive for 1,000 years, were beginning to tremble. He was only 21 years old. Apply, but the weight of centuries seemed to rest on his shoulders. Sultan Mehmed II, remembered by history as Mehmed the Conqueror, was not just another ruler in a long line of Ottoman sultans. Apply, he was a visionary, a strategist, a man who believed his destiny was carved into the very stones of Constantinople. Where others had seen failure, he saw inevitability. Apply. The Byzantine capital, the ancient prize that had eluded generations, was his to take, and he would stop at nothing until the crescent of the Ottomans rose above the cross of Byzantium. The Ottoman Empire had been growing like a storm on Europe's doorstep. From the deserts and mountains of Anatolia to the fertile plains of the Balkans, Apply. Their armies had swept across kingdoms and principalities, absorbing lands and peoples with relentless force. Each conquest brought them closer to Constantinople. Apply, the glittering jewel that had long defied them. To hold that city was not only a matter of pride but of power. Constantinople controlled the Bosporus. Apply, the narrow strait that joined the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. Whoever held that city commanded the flow of trade, wealth, and armies between east and west. For Mehmed, apply, it was not enough to be a sultan of lands, he wanted to be an emperor of worlds. But Mehmed was no reckless dreamer. He was educated, cunning, and consumed with ambition. Apply, he had studied history, mathematics, and warfare. He knew of Alexander the Great, of Julius Caesar, of the Roman emperors whose shadows still lingered in Constantinople's streets. Apply, and he wanted his name written beside theirs. To his soldiers, he was not merely a ruler but a chosen conqueror. He spoke of destiny, of prophecy. Apply, of how the prophet Muhammad himself had foretold that one day the city of Constantine would fall to the faithful. His men believed him. His empire believed him. Apply, unlike many rulers of his time, Mehmed embraced the new weapons of war. Where Byzantium clung to its walls and its past glory, Mehmed turned to innovation. Apply, he sought the help of engineers, blacksmiths, and inventors. Among them was a man named Orban, a master cannon maker from Europe, who promised to build weapons of unimaginable power. Apply, Mehmed gave him gold, iron, and all the resources he demanded. What emerged from Orban's forge were cannons so massive they required hundreds of oxen to drag them. Apply, these were not merely weapons. They were instruments of destiny, machines designed to tear down the walls that had mocked the Ottomans for centuries. Apply, the empire he commanded was unlike anything the Byzantines could muster. The Ottoman army stretched as far as the eye could see, tens of thousands of men. Apply, cavalry with flashing scimitars, archers with deadly precision, janissaries trained from childhood to be the Sultan's elite guard. They were disciplined, fearless, and fueled by faith. Apply. Each soldier believed he was part of something larger than himself. The rise of an empire that would stretch across continents. Apply. An empire that would stand as the successor not only to the Byzantines, but to Rome itself. Mehmed's determination was absolute. Advisors cautioned him, enemies mocked him. Apply, yet he pressed on. He had tasted defeat once before when an earlier attempt at Constantinople had failed. But this time was different. This time he was prepared. Apply. He built a fortress on the Bosporus to choke the city's supply lines, cutting Constantinople off from reinforcements and trade. Apply. He mobilized fleets to strike from the sea while his cannons roared against the walls. He left no escape, no chance for survival. Constantinople was not simply under siege. Apply. It was being strangled into submission. As his armies encircled the city, Mehmed rode among his men, speaking with passion, reminding them that this was not just a battle, apply, but a holy mission. He painted the vision of a new empire, with Constantinople as its beating heart, a capital that would eclipse even Rome. He promised them glory, riches, apply, and eternal honor. For some, it was the lure of treasure. For others, it was faith. But for all, it was the will of their sultan that drove them forward. And so, apply, as the cannons thundered and the ground shook, Mehmed stood firm, watching history bend to his will. The rise of the Ottomans had been steady, unstoppable, apply, but with Constantinople within his grasp, Mehmed II was about to transform his empire into something far greater. For the young sultan, it was not just a conquest. Apply, it was destiny fulfilled. When the first thunder of the Ottoman cannons echoed across the fields outside Constantinople, the defenders must have felt the earth itself rise against them. Apply. For centuries, siege engines had battered walls with stones and arrows, but nothing in human memory compared to what Sultan Mehmed II brought to the gates of the city. Apply. These were not weapons of war as the Byzantines knew them. They were monsters forged in fire and iron, titans of the new age of gunpowder, and leading them was the Great Bombard. Apply, designed by the Hungarian engineer Orban, a cannon so massive that it seemed less a weapon and more a force of nature. Apply. The cannon itself was a marvel, a colossal bronze tube over 27 feet long, its barrel wide enough for a grown man to crawl through. To move it, hundreds of men, teams of oxen, apply, and wagons of timber were required, dragging it inch by inch across the land until it reached the city's walls. Once in position, it became the beating heart of the siege. Apply, a weapon designed for one purpose alone, to break what history had declared unbreakable. Each shot was an ordeal of preparation. Gunpowder had to be carefully packed. Apply, and then came the stone projectiles, monstrous boulders weighing up to 200 pounds, carved smooth and shaped to fit the chamber. Loading took hours and firing required precision. Apply, timing and raw strength. But when it roared, the sound rolled across the fields like thunder, rattling bones and shaking the very foundations of the city. Apply, witnesses said it could be heard miles away, a voice of doom announcing that Constantinople's end was near. The first impact shook the defenders' confidence. At first, Apply. The stones smashed into the outer walls, sending showers of debris and dust into the air, leaving scars on the ancient masonry. The Byzantines rushed to repair the damage. Apply. Patching holes with rubble and timber, piling sandbags where stone had fallen. For a time, it seemed they might withstand the storm, but day after day, shot after shot. Apply. The cracks deepened. The mighty walls that had stood for 1,000 years began to groan under the relentless pounding of iron and stone. Fear spread through the city. Apply. Citizens who had once believed in the wall's invincibility now whispered that no stone could resist forever. Priests led processions through the streets. Apply. Raising icons and chanting prayers, pleading with heaven to intervene. But against the fire and fury of Mehmed's cannons, faith alone could not hold the stones together. Apply. The very symbol of Byzantine pride was being dismantled, one thunderous strike at a time. The psychological weight of those weapons was as devastating as their physical power. Apply. Each roar was a reminder that the age of walls was ending. For the soldiers standing atop the battlements, watching the stones rain down, it was a battle not only of arms but of spirit. Apply. They were not just defending a city, they were defending the idea that man could build something permanent, something eternal. Yet with every blast, Apply, that idea crumbled along with the walls. The Ottomans, too, felt the power of their creation. For them, the cannon was not just a weapon, but a symbol of destiny. Each time it fired, Apply, the ground quaked and their confidence surged. They saw the mighty city shaking, its walls cracking, and they knew the impossible was within their grasp. Apply. What their ancestors had failed to achieve with swords and ladders, they would achieve with fire and powder. The monster cannon became the hammer of fate. Apply, striking not only stone, but the heart of an empire. By the time the siege reached its climax, the defenders were exhausted from the endless cycle of repair and despair. Apply. Holes gaped in the walls, breaches widened, and the city's defenders grew fewer with each passing day. Apply. The roar of the bombard had become the grim rhythm of Constantinople's final days. It was no longer a question of if the walls would fall, only when. Apply. And as Mehmed's massive cannon bellowed again and again, the fate of Byzantium was sealed with every echo. Inside the walls of Constantinople, Apply, life became a slow descent into fear and desperation. At the start of the siege, there was still hope. Apply, a stubborn belief that the city, which had stood for more than 1,000 years, could endure yet another enemy at its gates. But as days turned into weeks and weeks into a month, Apply, that hope began to wither. The thunder of cannons never ceased. By day, the ground shook with each strike, and by night, Apply, the glow of Ottoman campfires stretched across the horizon like a sea of stars, a cruel reminder that the enemy was countless and escape was impossible. Food, once scarce but manageable, Apply, grew dangerously short. The great markets of the city, once overflowing with goods from every corner of the world, now stood nearly empty. Grain was rationed, water became precious, Apply, and meat was a luxury only a few could claim. Families who had once walked the marble streets in pride now hid in fear, Apply, clutching their children as the sound of crumbling stone echoed from the walls. Starvation crept into every home. Some boiled leather, others searched the ruins for scraps, Apply, and still others turned to desperate prayers, hoping for a miracle that never came. Tension thickened in the air. The defenders, exhausted and vastly outnumbered, Apply, were stretched thin across the walls. Each breach created by the Ottoman bombard had to be repaired under constant fire. Men and women alike carried stones, timber, and sandbags, Apply, patching holes in the dead of night. But the effort drained them. Each day, the breaches grew wider, and each night the repairs grew weaker. Apply. The city was fighting a battle it could no longer afford. Within the court of the last emperor, Constantine XI, the weight of history pressed down like never before, he was no fool. Apply. He knew the odds, knew that his city was facing the greatest military force the world had ever seen, yet he refused to abandon it. Apply. Constantine rallied his soldiers with speeches of courage, reminding them that they were not only defending their homes, but the faith and honor of Christendom. Still, Apply. His words could not fill stomachs, could not silence fear, could not erase the whispers of betrayal. And betrayal was indeed in the air. Apply. Some within the city doubted whether resistance was worth the sacrifice. Merchants and nobles, long weary of war and poverty, Apply. Questioned whether surrender might bring more mercy than continued defiance. Factions began to form, some urging negotiation, others vowing to fight to the last breath. Apply. Unity cracked as surely as the walls. The emperor pressed for solidarity, but in private chambers, suspicion grew. Could everyone within the city be trusted? Apply. Or would one desperate hand open the gates from within? Religious tensions also deepened the wound. For decades, Constantinople had stood at the crossroads of faith. Apply, caught between the Roman Catholic West and the Orthodox East. In their final days, the Byzantines sought help from Europe, but aid never came. Apply. Though a handful of Venetian and Genoese allies fought bravely at their side, the West did not send the armies the emperor had prayed for. Apply. Some citizens believed this abandonment was divine punishment. Others whispered of corruption and still more clung to their icons and holy relics. Apply. Carrying them through the streets in processions of tears and chants. Faith remained, but with every day of hunger, it grew harder to believe salvation would come from heaven. Apply. The streets grew silent at night, broken only by the cries of children and the distant thud of Ottoman cannons. Fires smoldered in abandoned homes. Shadows lingered in the alleyways. Apply, and the once great capital of the Byzantine world felt more like a tomb waiting to be sealed. Yet even in despair, there were sparks of defiance. Soldiers swore oaths of loyalty. Apply. Priests urged the faithful to hold strong, and the emperor himself stood shoulder to shoulder with common men on the walls, fighting not as a ruler, but as a soldier of a dying empire. Apply. The siege within the walls was not only a battle of weapons, but of will. It was hunger against courage, fear against faith, doubt against loyalty. Apply. Every hour tested the spirit of the Byzantines, and with each passing day, the cracks within the city's soul widened just as the cracks in its walls. Apply. Constantinople was not only collapsing from without, it was collapsing from within. The night before the final attack, Constantinople was cloaked in silence. The city's streets, Apply, once alive with markets and chants of worship, were hushed as if the stones themselves held their breath. The defenders knew what was coming. From the walls, Apply, they could see the endless fires of the Ottoman camp stretching across the plains, glowing like an ocean of flame. Drums beat in the distance, their rhythm slow and ominous. Apply, a heartbeat of the empire that had come to crush them. Inside the Hagia Sophia, priests led their last great procession. Men, women, and children gathered beneath the dome. Apply, their voices rising in prayer, their tears mingling with the candlelight as they begged heaven for deliverance. The Emperor Constantine XI, Apply, stood among them not as a ruler separated from his people, but as one of them, a man facing the end. When dawn broke, the horizon erupted. The Ottomans struck with everything they had. Apply, waves of soldiers surged toward the walls, their banners whipping in the wind, their cries of faith echoing across the battlefield. The earth shook under their charge. The cannons, Apply, which had pounded the city for weeks, roared one last time, shattering weakened stone and throwing dust into the morning air. Smoke and fire blanketed the field, and in that chaos, Apply, the assault began. The first waves were brutal, relentless, and merciless. Janissaries, the elite troops of the Sultan, pressed forward with ladders and shields. Apply, climbing into storms of arrows and stones hurled from above. The Byzantines fought with desperation, pouring boiling oil, unleashing Greek fire. Apply, striking with swords and spears against the tide. Men fell from the walls, others burned, and the air was filled with the screams of the wounded. Yet still, the defenders held. Apply, every breach was patched, every assault repelled, and for a moment it seemed as though the spirit of the ancient city might endure. But Mehmed was patient, cunning, and relentless. Apply, he sent his soldiers in waves, exhausting the Byzantines, testing their strength again and again. Each assault wore them thinner until their numbers were stretched beyond endurance. Apply, the emperor himself fought on the walls, his armor stained with dust and blood, rallying his men with cries of defiance. He refused to retreat, refused to abandon his city. Apply, those who saw him that day swore he fought not as an emperor, but as a warrior destined to fall with his people. As the battle raged, the breaches widened. Apply, the great cannon had done its work. The once mighty walls now gaped with holes large enough to funnel entire armies. The Ottomans poured through. Apply, their banners rising against the crumbling stone. Panic spread among the citizens. Some fled into the churches, clutching icons and relics, believing the sanctuaries would shield them. Apply, others grabbed weapons, willing to die defending their homes. The streets of Constantinople became rivers of chaos, filled with blood, fire, and terror. Apply, the final blow came when a small postern gate, left unguarded in the confusion, was forced open. Ottoman troops surged inside, flooding the city from within. The defenders, Apply, already broken and exhausted, could not withstand the tide. The cry went up that the city was lost. Yet even then, Emperor Constantine refused to flee. Surrounded by his soldiers, Apply, he tore the imperial insignia from his armor and plunged into the melee, vanishing into the clash of swords. His body was never found, his last stand forever shrouded in legend. Apply, but his defiance became the final heartbeat of Byzantium. By midday, the walls had fallen, the gates were open, and the Ottomans poured into the heart of Constantinople. The Hagia Sophia, Apply, once the crown of Christian faith, filled with terrified citizens as the doors were thrown wide. The city that had stood as the last bastion of Rome, Apply, that had endured sieges for over 1,000 years, had finally been broken. The final assault was not just the fall of a city, it was the end of an empire and the birth of a new world. Apply, when the last echoes of battle faded and the smoke drifted above the broken walls, a new silence fell over Constantinople. It was not the silence of peace, Apply, but the silence of something irrevocable. The city that had once been the shining capital of Byzantium now lay in the hands of a new master. On May 29, 1453, apply. Constantinople ceased to exist as the world had known it, and from its ashes a new era began. The Ottomans entered their prize with triumph. At their head rode Sultan Mehmed II. Apply. The young conqueror who had accomplished what countless others had failed to do. As he gazed upon the city's ruined streets, its fallen towers, and the great dome of the Hagia Sophia, apply. He knew this was more than a victory. It was destiny fulfilled. That very day, the ancient cathedral of Christendom was converted into a mosque. Apply, its soaring dome echoing not with chants of Greek priests, but with the calls to prayer of the muezzin. The symbol of Byzantium had become the jewel of Islam. Apply, and Constantinople was reborn as Istanbul, the beating heart of a new empire. For Europe, the shock was immense. News of the fall spread like wildfire across kingdoms and courts. Apply, shaking monarchs and popes to their core. The city that had once been a shield against the East, a guardian of Christian faith, was gone. Apply. Many feared it was the beginning of the end for Europe itself. But in history, endings are always beginnings. Apply. The fall of Constantinople cut off ancient trade routes that had long connected Europe with Asia, forcing merchants and explorers to seek new paths across the seas. Apply. Out of that desperation came the age of exploration, a time when ships sailed beyond the known world and discovered new continents. In a way, apply, the fall of one city opened the gates to the modern age. For the Ottomans, this was the moment of transformation. Mehmed I did not just take a city, he declared an empire. Apply. Istanbul became the new capital of the Ottoman world, a crossroads of cultures, faiths, and trade. From its walls, the Ottomans extended their reach across 3 continents. Apply, ruling for centuries as one of the most powerful empires in human history. The dream of Rome had ended in Constantinople, but its spirit lived on in a new empire. Apply, one that saw itself as the heir not only to Byzantium but to the legacy of the Caesars themselves. Yet the fall was more than politics and power. It was the end of a way of life. Apply, the Byzantine people whose ancestors had walked in the days of Constantine the Great, whose voices had once filled the hippodrome with cheers. Apply, whose artisans had painted mosaics that glittered like stars, were now subjects of a new world. Some fled west, carrying with them books, knowledge, apply, and traditions that helped spark the Renaissance. Others remained, their faith and culture living on in the shadows of Ottoman rule. The world they knew was gone. Apply, but their legacy endured in art, in learning, in memory. The fall of Constantinople was not just the end of an empire, it was a turning point for all humanity. Apply, it marked the death of the Middle Ages and the birth of the modern world. It was the closing of one chapter and the opening of another, written in fire, steel, and blood. Apply, the walls had crumbled, the emperor had fallen, but history had been reborn. And so, as we look back at that fateful day in 1453, apply, we see not only the tragedy of a city's fall, but the beginning of a new world order. A city that had once stood as the heart of one empire became the crown of another. Apply, the day Europe changed forever was not its end, but the start of a new journey, a new destiny, a new age. And if you've been captivated by this incredible story, apply, don't forget to like this video, subscribe for more journeys into history's greatest moments. Apply and share your thoughts in the comments below, because history lives on when we remember it together.